In this video, I don the teacher's cap. I'm a teacher in this video, and my subject to the class is how to write a good note. More specifically, because I am taking up the editorial of the Hindu, what you should avoid if you want to write a good note. How not to write is my subject. And for this, I have with me as teaching material, as an aid to teaching, the Hindu editorial of May 12, 2025. I say this because it is not my purpose to criticize the Hindus' dealing of a subject. I have nothing to do with the subject. But I want to make this an example of how you ought not to do what you ought not to do when you are wanting to write a note. Whether it is in your company or whether you are writing a piece for your magazine or for whatever you are wanting to do. So that is the subject. Let me go ahead. I am a reader, and for a reader he must understand what he is reading. Otherwise he'll be lost in a maze of words. For a writer, he should have a certain discipline in writing. These two things have to be borne in mind. Therefore, what a reader requires and what a writer requires, these are the two aspects that will come into play while I read the Hindu editorial. The heading of the editorial is Fire and Ceasefire. The subheading is India must not allow third-party meddling in Kashmir. Therefore, the convention in all these matters is that this is the subject matter, and therefore, I'm the reader. My brain is wanting to receive this information that has been given as a heading. That is ceasefire, and then India must not allow third-party meddling. So I want to know what you have to say on that subject. Simple. And there I am. My mind is getting prepared to receive that subject, that particular subject. Not anything and everything related to Kashmir or anything like that. So now, India and Pakistan on Saturday announced an understanding to stop military actions against each other after 3 days of intense and escalating fighting. Full stop. That intense and escalating, two adjectives, normally that need not be used in this particular case because the casualties on both sides were low, and therefore we need not really say it was intense fighting. But that is a matter of English. Therefore, we are still in some introductory sentence relating to the ceasefire. It was next sentence, it was United States President Donald Trump who first made the announcement of a ceasefire between the two countries, and in further statements, American officials have said US Vice President Vance and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio were in close touch with leaders of both countries, including Prime Minister Narendra Modi, helping them arrive at this understanding. So far, only factual statements have been given. Please understand, these are all factual statements. Now the reader wants to know, what have you to say? So facts are given as an introduction. But what happens is truly amazing. That subject is abandoned. The subject you started with, the subject which is referred to as the heading, now you have abandoned it in the next sentence. The current flare-up was caused by the terrorist attack of tourists in Pahalgam on April 22. Now, we want to know about the ceasefire and the so-called involvement and meddling of others. Nothing. So the subject has been abandoned, and another totally unrelated matter has come in. Next one, Pakistan has used terrorism as an unstated policy. God, this has nothing to do with the subject. This deserves a separate separate editorial. If you say Pakistan's unstated policy is terrorism, then you will have to explain it in a different editorial. Here we have on a specific thing you started with. You just dropped it. You've abandoned it. This is for all those who write a note. Keep your focus on your subject. Don't go sideways and then make all these kinds of statements which may be true, may not be true, whatever it is, has no place in your note. So that is important, because you should keep your job. If you write a note on something and you go sideways all over the place, then you may not be able to retain your job. That's important level. Keep the focus if you have something to say. And if you are not yet prepared to deal with this subject and you require more information, you can wait for it and not, come up with all these kinds of unrelated statements and a hodgepodge of various assertions. Now, this is what goes on until the very last. It's amazing, but that's how it is. Pakistan has used terrorism as an unstated policy. By demonstrating that India can take overt military action against targets in Pakistan in the event of a terrorist attack, the Narendra Modi government has effectively announced a new security doctrine. Now, if you want to speak about a new security doctrine, that has to have a separate editorial, not be squeezed into a subject that is specific. What is the subject? Ceasefire, and whether others were involved or in brokering a ceasefire. That is completely abandoned. That's my point. There's something to be avoided when you write a note. Pakistan will not be allowed to hide behind deniability and continue to promote terrorism against innocent people. Now, even the tone is different. This is a hectoring tone. Pakistan will not be allowed. Therefore, keep your tone the same. Let there be some kind of, when someone reads, let there be a flow, not only of the idea, but the tenor. Now, suddenly a hectoring tone. Pakistan will not be allowed. No, that doesn't come in, and also it is irrelevant to the main subject. Then again, simply a completely different thing. There you go, off on a tangent, has nothing to do. The Indian Armed Forces performed with stellar courage and professionalism, while civilians in Jammu and Kashmir paid a heavy price in terms of lives, peace and property. God, this is a completely different thing, and a very important thing at that. It is a very important subject. That is, on the one side you say all the stellar courage, Indian Armed Forces, and then you say who pays the price? The civilians, and the loss of property, the loss of lives and things like that. So that requires a separate subject. There is a little bit of English there which I must point out, and that is, The English is something like this. The Indian Armed Forces performed with stellar courage and professionalism, while civilians in Jammu and Kashmir paid a heavy price in terms of lives, peace and property. This is while Rome was burning, Nehru was fiddling. There is that contrast. It is in those contexts, in that kind of statement, that this while should be done. While. Otherwise, it is jarring. It is really, you ask yourself, come on, how did it change suddenly that you speak of the courage and then say, while people are so? These two things really are antithetical. But they are two different things, really. Antithetical. Suddenly, courage and all that, then say, while Jammu and Kashmir civilians, suffered loss of lives and things like that. You see, okay. The people of Punjab also had to bear the brunt of the conflict. Another one, okay, a little bit loose there, sentence. Nothing to do with the original subject. In the midst of the fire, the Modi government underscored a key principle of Indian identity, that it is pluralistic, multi-religious and democratic, and correctly identified Pakistan's strategy to create communal discord in the country. Come on, these are big things really, and ought to be really studied and properly explained and argued in an editorial. That is a prime duty of anyone who writes a note. You can't just throw the assertions right and left. You lose your job if you do that. That is, one is a key principle of Indian identity, pluralistic, multi-religious and democratic. So the principles of identity, Indian identity. And Pakistan's strategy to create communal discord in the country. Oh, come on, explain with some kind of evidence and some kind of backing with facts. Of course, not in this where you started with ceasefire and involvement. Not here, but make it a separate essay. So you see this is the first part. Terrible, really. And you got my point, that focus on what you wanted to do in the first place. You gave a heading. Keep going on that and stop when you have done with it. But before you write a note, you must prepare. Because if you are not prepared, you might indulge in this kind of thing. That is, you start with the heading, then throw in anything that you like into this business, into this essay. This is what has happened. Now, the next paragraph. Now that a war has been avoided and the conflict been brought to a halt, the Modi government must take stock and share its learning with the people of India and their representatives. Oh, now that's a little bit of a preaching tone on another subject. That is, what are the lessons that you learned? What are the losses you suffered? You must share it with the people of India. That is a different thing. You can write an editorial on that and show with examples how other countries have done and things like that. Quite legitimate, but not to be done in this way. Throwing it into an essay which purports to be an essay on ceasefire and whether others were involved in brokering the ceasefire. This kind of tone goes on, the opposition counters and all that. The center can no longer remain silent on key questions regarding developments during the operations, the deaths and losses. Now, that seems to imply again the same thing, a little bit, the tone is all a little bit of hectoring, and that is, what are your losses in terms of military assets? Probably referring to the question, did we lose any fighters? That is, if a responsible paper were to do that, they have to write a separate editorial and say, come out with facts and things like that. Nothing wrong in a newspaper calling for the facts after an engagement, a military engagement like this. So all a little vague, but it is regarding developments during the operation, the deaths and the losses. Losses means losses in military assets. truth cannot be allowed to be a casualty in war. God. This kind of dictum, Esecles, 500 years before Christ, before the Christian era, Esecles, the great dramatist, came out with this statement. Now you suddenly throw in that statement also of Esecles, the great Athenian dramatist. There's a well-known quote, truth is the first casualty in war. 500 years before the Christian era, that is this quote. They threw in that also. Let's have that also into the mix and see what happens. Just throwing in a little bit of pepper, a little bit of green chili and all that. Let us see what happens. Recent days have demonstrated significant new turns in geopolitics that have implications for India. Now, this is a point that has been made by various foreign newspapers, including the much respected The Economist. Man, pushing in a sentence from there into this mix, that isn't fair. As they say, that isn't cricket at all. That new turn in geopolitics. It's a separate statement and a separate issue. And they try to say how China reportedly supported Pakistan's operations and so on. And then the conclusions, always the conclusion will have to be where you started the subject. You should conclude your subject. And this is neither here nor there. This one, this is the way it concludes. For a country to be able to secure itself and prosper, a general statement, there must be cool-headed thinking among its leaders, domestic political consensus and social harmony, and a respect for professional views as opposed to jingoistic slogans. The word jingoism has got a big history. You've thrown in that also, and suddenly a big pontification. For a country to be able to secure itself and prosper, there must be cool-headed thinking among its leaders, domestic political consensus and social harmony, and a respect for professional views as opposed to jingoism as pontification. But this pontification does not sit well with your subject. It has nothing to do with the subject. So my point is that most of these sentences are dangling sentences, having nothing to do with the subject. And when you write a note, please see that you avoid this kind of thing at all. I hope you always have the subject and what you have to say closely argued in a cohesive whole. Now quickly I want to tell you that about the same time, this is 12th May, on 13th May, I was reading something in, let me be specific, in the Financial Times, London, and that is a good example. As they write every day, very good, cohesive, good writing. I'll give you a quick example. On 13th of May, they wrote this editorial in the Financial Times. The heading is an uneasy US-China detente on tariffs. Uneasy detente. That is the subject. And the subheading is also in line with the subject. The heading and the subheading clearly show what they are going to say about. So the reader gets prepared and wants to be briefed or wants to learn what they have to say, wants to understand what they have to say. The subheading is, the uncertainty around Trump's trade war has not gone away. So you see, that is the way they are going to argue, that it's not gone away. And this is how they start. The 3-month detente in the US-China trade war announced yesterday morning is undoubtedly a relief for the global economy. They explain that a little and then say immediately after 2 sentences, but optimism should be tempered. See, they are quickly arguing that while it has kind of perked up the spirits, if you can say, of the global economy, if that can be used at all, they things seem to be livening up. Optimism should be tempered. We should be cautious. And then they argue the case for this conclusion, for this assessment very, very closely. Not one sentence is loose. Everything goes into a beautiful flow of substantiating the reason why they say that we should be guarded, that optimism should be tempered. And then after, they are very specific on these things really, because first, second and things like that, they argue very well. First, though tariff rates between the US and China are no longer in 3 digits, they are still elevated in historical terms. And second, there is no guarantee that the 3-month truce will lead to an enduring ceasefire. So you see the way it is going, all very much in line, very consistent with the opening subject, with what you wanted to say. That is how a good note ought to be written. Finally, investors should be wary of extrapolating too much from the UK and Chinese deal. And how it goes on after saying risk appetite was animating trading desks around the world yesterday, safe haven assets sold off and all that. They say lingering economic uncertainty and the non-binding nature of America's latest trade deals should be enough of a reason for caution. Add in a mercurial president and market bullishness is hard to comprehend. There is no reason why markets should be bullish. So this is the smooth flow of a central idea taken to its conclusion. And the conclusion is, add in a mercurial president and market bullishness is hard to comprehend. So, as I conclude this one, I want this video, I want to say this. If you choose a subject, first of all, study the subject and present the subject in such a way that you closely argue what you have in mind. Never go sideways all over the place, you lose your job. And then reach a conclusion that is in line with your argument. You are arguing not for the sake of arguing, but for reaching a conclusion. This is regarding today's lesson on what ought not to be written, the ways that you should avoid, and a fair example of how you should write.